society, and yet you also deal with the idea of the impact it had on the men and the idea of masculinity that they have, the idea of PTSD, that nobody has the words to talk about these things and really process it. And I was interested in how that shaped, both genders of characters throughout the storytelling for you.
Yeah, it's a really important part of the whole thing. I mean, I think you hear it in Ruth's, one of the opening scenes where she's talking to Maury about, and she really understands this, that there's a kind of crisis of masculinity post-war. All these men kind of floating around who've been heroes in the war and are now, kind of nobodies again. And Ruth really sees this and kind of sees an opportunity for herself in a funny kind of way, because she's so ambitious, she's determined not to be, I mean, she comes from a difficult background, an impoverished kind of family, and she's so determined to make something of herself. She's got this burning ambition, which I love about her. It's one of the things that really drew me to her as a character. She just doesn't give, she's just so determined to kind of make it on her own terms, kind of whatever way she can. And so I think that whole backdrop of the 1950s, which is this very curious time in London, where there's this kind of very brittle glamour in these clubs, these people kind of desperately kind of seeking something to kind of lose themselves in. And it just really informed the whole piece so much for me, and especially with the men, because I think they're all affected. Bickford, all of the things are kind of true in the drama. Bickford kind of really affected by his wartime experiences. And so was Desmond Cusson, really. So it's a sort of uneasy backdrop to the whole thing.
Yeah. And Lucy, in talking about Ruth, she comes across as someone who's really intelligent, but also very perceptive about herself and the world around her. I've heard you talk about how there were accounts of David that anointed with the fact that he did have a temper, but because of his class, it was received in a very different way to any emotion that she would show. And so how did that shape a lot of your portrayal of the character, particularly in things like the court scenes and after she'd been arrested for this crime, and understanding how people were perceiving her constantly?
I think that's one of the most interesting elements about her, is her complete understanding of the chessboard of society that she operates in, that she is totally clued in on the way that people see her based on her class, her gender, no matter how much she tries to change her appearance and her voice. It is a closed-door society. We are quite obsessed in the UK, I think, with this kind of a hierarchical class system. But she, as Kelly was saying, she was so determined to break that and to break through that. And I think those court scenes were so, you'll see when you watch the next episode, was so sickening to act in, because she was criticized for appearing very cold and very inaccessible. So she's critiqued for being, the imperfect victim. But that's because, as we discussed, she has 28 years of experience knowing how society treat her and see her. There was a predetermined idea of who and how she was, and she wasn't going to give more of herself. That in itself is indicative of not only her complete understanding of the social landscape, but that brittleness of self-preservation that was so fascinating to have to kind of exit my own instincts of empathizing with her and feeling frustrated that she won't advocate for herself, and realizing that she knew all too well to. And I think another element that's so important to note is that this was a shocking story, this was a shocking case at the time, but people were so outraged because it was a working class woman who killed a man from the upper class, the upper echelon, and that just kind of speaks volumes.
Yeah, and Bessie, with your character, I feel like, to Lucy's point, with the class structure being so rigid, and even more so at the time period of the story, it really infiltrates into the way that your character perceives Ruth and their interactions, and also the relationship that she has with David as someone that she's known for a long time and is much more excusing of his behavior. And so how did that idea of the class system and that structure really shape the relationships around her for you?
Yeah, Carol and David were part of the club, and Ruth wasn't a member. And Carol and her husband Anthony, they worked really hard to try to preserve that upper class divide, which was shaking at that time. And I think Ruth coming along and sort of being probably a lot of what Carol wished she could be. I think sometimes you're most threatened by people who you see something in yourself. And seeing her as this financially independent woman who was having this beautiful love affair, She was, I think, probably quite jealous and wanted to keep that wall up and did her damnness to, I mean, you saw a bit of her, but there is a bit more of that, I think, to come.
It's so interesting. And Kate, in producing this series, I wanted to ask about the development process with Carol Ann Lee's book as the source material, because, you know, it sounds like there's so many research details that went into that, and it's so vivid, and it kind of really allows this series to tell a story that's set in the present, but also gives us so much backstory to who Ruth was and kind of what led to certain choices and kind of who she was in the world.
Yes, I mean, I think I'd always known who Ruth Ellis was, and actually what happened is I got an email from one of Ruth's grandsons to say that the true story of his grandmother had never been told, and was I interested in meeting, and I was like, definitely, and he's the one who sort of said, you should have a look at Carol Ann's book. So Antonia and I read the book, talked to Kelly, and the book is it's an incredibly researched book, and it covers all this hidden history that I had no idea of. I think lots of people, you know, don't know. That was a film, a famous film, Dance with a Stranger, that was filmed in the 1980s, that ended with Ruth shooting Blakely and never covered what happened afterwards. So that book for us was everything in terms of creating the story.
And I feel like, Lucy, you brought up such a great point about filming some of the court sequences and as yourself wanting to advocate for her, but not necessarily being able to because that wasn't how it played out. And so she wanted to ask all of you about just the experience in making a story like this and having the perspective that you have through the modern lens, but also having to tell it in a way that's very authentic and true to how it played out.
I think that's why it kind of, this whole process affected me so much more than I could have anticipated or prepared for. Because, you know, when you're dealing with, when you're filming dark, really heavy dark material, you can leave it at work because you can leave it with the kind of safety in fiction. This, it was, I mean, physically difficult to film a lot of this, but also just that rattled feeling where it gets into your bones, that there is nothing that you can do to undo this tremendous misjustice, and you can see it through the contemporary lens, so you can see how it played out in broad daylight with an audience, with a public who didn't want it to happen either. So it was just this kind of bureaucratic political move, and she was used as an example. And so there's a kind of restlessness that comes with that understanding, and then to sit in the knowledge that what Ruth went through in terms of that relationship with Blakely is still such a contemporary problem that, like, I approached this press tour with all this research hoping that I could present positive numbers. And the rates of domestic violence, especially in the UK, are horrific, and kind of, and I keep saying on this press tour, it's so vital to keep challenging our system and examining how our judicial system treats women. And so there was no kind of respite in getting to leave this because there is still so much needing to be addressed, I think.
Yeah. But it was also, because it was so important for us to also see it as through the terms of 1955, because you look back now and we think, of course we think, my God, it's so obvious that she shouldn't have been executed for what she did. But it was important to try and kind of position it in the eyes of somebody in the 1950s. So I think you see it through Bickford's point of view. I mean, people knew then that it was an outrage, but the kind of machinations of the British establishment kind of conspire in various ways that you'll see against her. So through the eyes of the 1950s, it's an outrageous story, and it kind of gets more outrageous, you know, with time. Obviously, it resonates today, but it's, by the standards of the time, was also just a real shocker.
And Kate, in producing this show as well, I mean, the details that went into the production design and the costumes and even just the aesthetic of the way that it's filmed, and you can edit back and forth between the different parts of the timeline and it feels so connected to itself. I was just interested in some of the logistics of that all coming together from your end.
Well, we were always determined that we wanted to film in London because obviously that's where it all happened. We were very lucky in the sense that we wanted to use as many of the real locations as we could. So we filmed the shooting outside the Magdala pub in Hampstead where it happened. We filmed in the real magistrates' court, which I think probably was, you know, for Lucy standing actually in that dock which you saw in Ep1 where Ruth had stood, where, you know, to put her plea in. We filmed in Townsend Road where the Finlaters lived. We filmed in the Old Bailey, and then we had the most incredible HODs, and it was things like the production designer. We had photos of Ruth in her flat that was above the her apartment that was above the Little Club, and he looked at the wallpaper and recreated the wallpaper that was on the walls in her flat. So that kind of attention to detail was extraordinary to watch everyone, you know, all the people making the show made it with such passion. It was fantastic to see the level of detail that people went to.
Bessie, I was also curious about your perspective of Carol's relationship with David, because, you know, she'd also had a romantic history with him and kind of seemed very aware of a lot of his behavior, but he hadn't necessarily acted that way towards her. And so how for you did you shape that history, and how did it influence the way that you felt like she then saw Ruth?
Yeah, I remember reading that in the book, that I think the word was tendresse, if I remember correctly. Tendresse, triggering, sorry. I remember reading that she had an affair with him in the book and being really shocked, but then also then researching that time period and that sort of bourgeoisie, middle class hanging out of Hampstead, you know, houses smoking a fag. It was all part of that, sort of, it was acceptable. But I also found it amazing that Carol went back to her husband, Anthony, and they just swept it under the rug. Again, quite a British thing. Like, let's just pretend that didn't happen. It's healthy. So I do think that there is, again, going back to my point, like, I think there was a real jealousy that he's, you know, he struck up this fiery relationship with Ruth. So yeah, did I answer your question? Oh no, but I also wanted to say, how weird is this? You brought up Tanzer Road. I grew up with a girl who lived at primary school on the bottom of Tanzer Road, which is where Carol and Anthony lived. So I was playing in the garden, she had like chickens as well. And so when we found out we were filming on that real location, I was like, this is so weird. 11-year-old me would have been like, what? I found that really amazing.
I love those serendipitous connections that you find sometimes. Lucy, I was also interested in just the physical aspect of your performance, because there's such a stark difference in how we see her when she's moving through the club and is kind of like very full of energy, and then just the stillness that we see after this has all happened, and the stoicness that she kind of absorbs into herself, and it's almost like her body's absorbing the trauma of this. And so how did you find the kind of physical trajectory of all that?
It was kind of mapping that out of, she is someone who's so, hasn't been given space by society, so has just chipped at it and carved it out for herself. And so then knows, and again, like we talked about, knows how she's perceived, so wants to be the author of that. So when she moves through the Little Club, there is this kind of fluidity to her and openness and magnetism that is kind of very deliberate. And then she's still trying to sustain it, and it's just being chipped away at because of what I think she's physically going through. And then in those court scenes, it was, I think that is the joy of, and the privilege of, like, camera work, where it's like the camera's so close so the audience gets to be right up in it, where you can still achieve that presentation to what the jury would experience, which is nothing, ice, and impenetrable. And then the audience, because we're right in it, can see the kind of the break in all of that, see the person that is coping beat by beat just under that mask.
Did you have a sense, kind of like with the director of the series, that you wanted to have that intimacy with the camera work? Because I think, to Lucy's point, it really does give the audience a viewpoint that nobody else around her has.
Yeah, I mean, Lee is a director I've worked with a few times, and he's extraordinary, along with his DOP. But in Kelly's scripts, there were lots of flashbacks, there were lots of flash forwards. We wanted it to feel visceral and intense and emotional, as well as capturing sort of the glamour of her life and all the vibrancy of it. But we definitely, in the edit, we sort of played around with where those, you know, where you went in close, where you went to have a flash forward, just to give you that sort of shock of what's to come. So yeah, I mean, we worked again with an incredible team with the editor and director.
Kelly, with the writing, one of the other aspects that I thought was so interesting and truthful in how the story was told is that the physical abuse is obviously front and center, but the emotional abuse is just as prevalent within this relationship. And it was really interesting to see the way that that was portrayed, and the kind of victimhood that he has to kind of keep himself in this relationship, and the way that he manipulates as well. And so I just wanted to ask about how you set about shaping that and the importance of that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, David doesn't see himself as an abuser. I think he feels quite wronged by his own, you kind of find out in episode 2, he's had his own problems in his life, and I think, he sees probably him and Ruth as having a sort of tempestuous, love affair. And of course, it just couldn't be further from the truth. But it's, I think, the sort of subtleties of that, of how you see Ruth drawn into it and how you see her so intoxicated by him. I mean, there's this dance that the two of them do. It's so complex. It's not as simple as that he just beats her up, It's a tricky line because you never want to say that a victim's in any way culpable for abuse that they suffer. But there's kind of a psychological complexity to it in the way that, they become so enmeshed and sort of dependent on each other. That it was just psychologically just so interesting for me. And, very, hardly any of it is fictionalized. I mean, I've drawn out these characters kind of on the page, but this is who they really were. So much of their dialogue, in fact, is from Ruth's accounts of their relationship that she gave in prison or in other places. So that's how they really were, and there's just such a toxicity to it. But I think there's a magnetism as well, where you're really compelled by them as a couple. That I found it just so interesting to write, because they're both just really, really interesting characters.
Yeah, and Lucy, there's of course another relationship that we see with Desmond throughout the series, and what's interesting to see about that is kind of he comes across as more caring and more level-headed, but we kind of start to see the problems develop there as well. And what was some of the complexities that you found in that relationship, in addition to getting to play the one with David?
I think that's why you're so lucky. I mean, Sam Jones, our casting director, is like my savior. She has assembled such a brilliant team, and the contrast with what Mark Stanley did with Desmond and Laurie Davidson with David, where they both kind of brought out the contrast of real charm, real kind of endearing softness, so you can completely empathize with what draws a person in and makes them feel safe. And I think Desmond is particularly good at that, or has that in him, the kind of nurturing quality, or wanting to be the man who looks after her and saves her. But what you see from both of them is that they have this projected idea of her, and they are dealing with that projection of her, and so when she strays from that, they kind of don't know how to deal with her, don't want to, as she is. And I think that's kind of, it was such an interesting examination. It was really interesting to see what they both, kind of how that came to life, and kind of all of the details and nuances that the audience is let in on, that perhaps the people kind of surrounding those people wouldn't be able to be privy to. So it was, incredibly complex.
Yeah. Well, you've all done such a phenomenal job in creating this series. You guys are in for such a treat when you see the rest of the episodes. So thank you so much for sharing it with us, and thank you for joining us.